All right. I'm recording on the computer because I did send I did send the Purim spiel to Bill, and that
And it,
went through okay once he
yeah,
collected it on Google Drive. Anyway, hello. We're going to start studying the Book of Leviticus today, and it's a tough interregnum in the narrative of the Bible. Yes, Kathy,
But I just have like one quick follow up from last week's,
of course.
because we were talking. I had a question about whether the that had the instructions for the Mishkan. Is that what you
Hmm.
call it? And I was wondering why you would need a temple if you had that. And you had said that Solomon. I would need to look at the Solomon chapter. So I was looking at that, and it kind of answered a question I'd had, because I had heard some people don't want to go to Israel until the Messiah comes because they feel
Hmm.
like the temple can't be rebuilt until then.
Hmm.
And it looks like it's what it actually says, because Nathan told David, well, he said that God had said that he was happy with the portable, whatever it
Hmm.
was, and that maybe, that one of his descendants would build a temple to his name, not a presence temple.
Hmm.
And then people thought that was Solomon. But I guess a lot of people think that that's actually referring to some far future date when a Messiah will come. And so that kind of answer, clarify, I'm sort of agreeing with them, I guess, those people.
Yeah, I think the Jewish people, the early Hebrews, they wanted to see something tangible. Um, the Mishkan, you got to figure that the Mishkan, which was taken apart and put back together and taken apart and put back together by the end of 40 years in the desert, let alone the intervening couple of hundred years, was probably pretty beat up. And uh, and the I think that the thinking of the Israelites of circa 1000 BCE was something along the lines of, we are settled here in Jerusalem now. We have entered the promised land. We're settled in Jerusalem. We need a permanent edifice that marks our permanent residence in this land. Um, it's not that dissimilar from the thinking of Jews in the 1950s as they spread out in America, as they spread out to the suburbs and say, we are here in this promised land out of Brooklyn, out of the city, and we need to put up a permanent building, a building that shows we are here. And people want tangible expressions of of their success, of their permanence. So it's not at all surprising that by King David's time, people were already saying, um, let's build a permanent temple.
It is surprising, though, that God would tell Nathan to say no to David. So,
Because God was usually on the side of not building showy displays to him, to God.
mhm.
Um, God knew at this point that, I mean, there can be a fine line between the erection of a big building in honor of God and idol worship. It's God was always a little bit leery of permanent structures, but the Hebrews needed them. They needed to show, hey, we got here, we fought battles, we we subdued the neighbors, at least to the extent that they won't proselytize their polytheism among us. We need a temple. And the idea of people not wanting to go to Israel until a temple is rebuilt, they're looking for the third temple. And the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. The second temple was destroyed pretty much in the same place by the Romans. That's almost 2,000 years ago. Since then, you've got the Muslims came on the scene, and that little bit of turf where the temple once stood is theirs now. They control it. The Mosque Al-Aqsa is built there. So the question of should there be a third temple on the same site is in some ways a moot question for those of us who are like, we have synagogues all over the world. We don't need a third temple in Jerusalem. And for everyone who would kind of like to see a third temple, it's a political question. Is it worth the strife that
Well, if you
would
just said it was the Messiah that was going to build it, then that's kind of like off in, a fairy tale land.
that it is often
So you
fairy
can
tale
just
land,
you can
and
just leave that kind of as a way of dealing with it without actually having to deal with it.
yeah, oh yeah, I'm sure that's what a lot of messianic fervor from both Orthodox and secular Jews is about. It's a way of looking forward to something that will that in your heart, looking forward to something that your brain knows will never come.
And it
And,
offers some peaceful solution in the meantime. So,
right, but there is no peaceful solution to a third temple.
well, there might be if there was truly a Messiah, then you would assume that God would be.
Yeah, well, I'm not holding my breath since not to sound flip about it, but um and anyway, those of us who we talk about not so much the Messiah coming back in person, but for the rising of a messianic age where everyone is at peace and prosperous. That's what we want. Many of us, we don't really need some guy or some gal to come onto the scene and say, hi, I'm the Messiah, everything's going to be okay now. You want to ask, you're only one person, for whom is everything going to be okay? How are you going to bring this about? It's for a lot of moderns, it's become more, when we invoke Messiah in liturgy, for example, we're really talking about a messianic age, and that would be great, but again, we're not holding our breath. Okay, so on to Leviticus. Okay, Leviticus is a difficult book because it's all rules. There's almost no narrative in it at all. It's 27 chapters of rules. And a lot of the rules don't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And even some of the ones that do make sense are so gross that you just don't want to deal with them. I said last week, this is why I've told B'nai Mitzvah parents over the years, don't schedule your child's bar mitzvah for March or April, because you're going to run right into Leviticus, and with very few exceptions, your kid is not going to be happy with what he or she is reading in the Torah portion. Some of it, again, on the Peshat level, on the simple literal level, a lot of it seems boring. A lot of it seems pointless, especially in modern times. the Eitz Chaim commentary acknowledges this right up front, says, Leviticus is a difficult book for a modern person to read with reverence and appreciation. Its main subject matter, animal offerings and ritual impurity, seems remote from contemporary concerns. As we're going to see as we read about, the rules of sacrifice, animal sacrifice. But because it's all about the rules, and not just rules of animal sacrifice and ritual purity, but there's a lot of real world wisdom among the mitzvot of how you're supposed to conduct yourself in the world. This is the book that Orthodox children, that traditional children is first taught. They learn Leviticus first. They learn the rules. Then they get to the story. So the first, we'll talk about, we'll look at some of the sacrifices, and we'll talk about why these sacrifices, why these animals for this wrongdoing, or we'll talk about the different kinds of sacrifices that were made. Why did people need to make sacrifices in the first place? What substitutes for them today? Because there's lots of reference still in our liturgy to animal sacrifice, even though we haven't used animal sacrifice for centuries. Anyway, the idea of animal sacrifice itself is a holdover from more ancient Near Eastern societies, who believed that the gods required actual physical food for their sustenance. You had to feed the gods. They were humanoid to the extent that they required actual meat on the barbecue and baked goods in order to sustain themselves. The Torah preserves this, but the idea is that God requires sacrifices, not because God has any kind of corporeal form and needs food, but because the animal sacrifice and the grain sacrifice and the sacrificing of birds, all the sacrifices show a measure of devotion from God's worshipers. This is in an agrarian society. This was how you showed allegiance and showed devotion. You gave up some of your crop or some of your herd. And so what doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us made perfect sense to the early Hebrews. There's a lot of specificity to these rituals, to the rituals we read about in Leviticus, including this week's Torah portion about the animal sacrifices, because it provides the satisfaction of doing something right, doing something just the right way. And some people get very hung up on that. They get so hung up on it that they forget the spirit of what you're doing. We had the example early in my tenure as rabbi of the Chavarah. A guy came into the Chavarah, and he was married to, he was a Navy guy married to a rabbi, as it happened. And he told the woman lighting the candles, that she was doing it wrong. Okay, I wanted to kill him. because first of all, who cares? Second of all, he was embarrassing her, and that's much wrong, more wrong. That's a much bigger sin than lighting the Shabbat candles wrong. So, so the idea of doing it right is something, again, that doesn't make too much sense for those of us who are of the close enough for jazz school. But I do admire, I do admit a certain satisfaction in doing something exactly right, and in replicating rituals and mitzvot that go back further than our parents and grandparents. Um, one of the draws of specific religious ritual and detailed religious ritual is that it puts us as a link in the chain to ancient times. We're part of a chain that goes back well over 2,000 years. And when we observe a Jewish commandment, we're not breaking the chain. Now, you can argue that the chain was broken in terms of animal sacrifice in 70 CE, but with the destruction of the Second Temple. But we have replaced sacrifice with other mitzvot and other practices, and those reach back a long way too. So the first sacrifice that Torah talks about is the burnt offering, the olah. The Hebrew word for that is olah. If you see the word olah in any passage, it has to do with burnt sacrifice. That's where you slaughter an animal, put it on the fire, and last week we saw where the altar, the altar for offering animal sacrifice was in relation to the rest of the Mishkan. It's inside the Mishkan, but not inside the part where only priests can go. It was the priests who handled the animals, but anyone could watch. Anyone could stand there and watch, including, of course, the people who brought the animals and other items for sacrifice. Anyway, the olah, the burnt offering, is where the animal is slaughtered and completely burnt up on the altar. The only I think the only thing taken is the hide. They might have skinned the animal before roasting the meat. And in all the passages that have to do with offering sacrifice, the Israelites are told to burn something in a way that makes a pleasing odor to God, a reach nichoach, a pleasing odor. In other words, have it smell like really good barbecue. And so the burnt offering is used. It's called olah, which is from the Hebrew root that means going up, because the flame and the smoke are going up to heaven. And the purpose of the olah was to offer something to God, to curry favor with God, to offer a gift to God to secure a favorable response. Oh, this guy is giving, God's supposed to be saying, this guy is giving me an entire ox on the altar. He's given up an entire ox. Therefore, I should make sure he has a good year on his farm. is what we're supposed to make God think. So the demands, the details of this, if you look at chapter 1 of Leviticus, it's very detailed. It's not just any animal you bring an animal without blemish. And that, in other words, the very best animal you have of that type in your herd or on your farm. You do save the hide because it's flayed first. The skin is taken off first. And the only exception being the lamb offered in the springtime, which was burned up whole. And which is why at Passover, if you're going to eat lamb, you eat only roasted lamb. And so, and it's Aaron, the high priest, and his sons, the assistant priests, who lay out the meat on the grill and burn it up. And there's just detail after detail with what you're supposed to do, where you what you wash in water, what you how you and of course how you cut up the offering, what the priests are supposed to do, what actions they take. And it says in several places, he, meaning Aaron, shall lay his hand upon the head of the offering. And it's all very, very specific. My chumash in describing, in commenting on the phrase without blemish, is what renders an animal unfit in the sight of God does not disqualify the human being who offers it. The offering must be unblemished as a sign of respect for God's altar and to discourage people from bringing their lame and sick animal in a pretense of piety. Okay, if Torah didn't say without blemish, people might say, well, I've got this 3-legged calf, it's not worth anything, that's what I'll put on the altar. You can't do that. So in chapter 1, we hear about the burnt offerings from going from the ox to the sheep or the goats to what you do with birds if you're bringing birds as the sacrifice. And that's what chapter 1 is about. All the details, all the rules for bringing an animal sacrifice to the altar to be burned up in its entirety. And the part that makes most people go, ew, is, there it is. At chapter 1, verse 5, the bull shall be slaughtered before God. Aaron's sons, the priests, shall offer the blood, dashing the blood against all sides of the altar, which is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The burnt offering shall be flayed and cut up into sections. So that dashing the blood against the sides of the altar, that's the ew point for most people reading this. And it doesn't, my chumash doesn't give a lot of explanation about why they do that. But and I can't help but feel that that offering a pleasing odor to God is a way of, be sure you cover up the nasty smells that are going to be produced by having, animal blood and animal entrails lying around. So chapter 2 talks about the grain offering. This is what a farmer could bring if he couldn't or she couldn't afford to sacrifice an animal. You could bring a measure of flour, but again, it had to be the nicest flour. The grain offering is called mincha, and it's considered just as sacred as an animal sacrifice. But you had to make the mincha, this offering, the choice part of the wheat taken from the inner kernels, the what we know today as semolina. And this is why pasta makers will say, "Oh, made only with the finest semolina flour." And they so the offerer of the grain would take this fine flour, mix olive oil into it or spread it on top, and would also apply some frankincense, which is an aromatic resin. And they would cook the dough. They would make cakes out of it. It could be cooked in on a griddle, in a pan, or in an oven. And some of it would be burnt to ashes on the altar, but a lot of it would be eaten by the priests. This is how they got their food in some part. These offerings, by the way, could be offered by men or women. The word usually used for the person bringing something is nefesh, which means soul, not human being. But even the word Adam, which is taken to mean man because it's the same, it's Adam's name. Even that simply means human being and can be of any gender. So again, chapter 2 gives us very specific directions for preparing the mincha, the grain offering. How you mix it. Don't put leavening in it. Make a pleasing odor to God. And bring your best. Okay, if you can't afford an animal sacrifice, you can afford to mill some of your ripe grain into the best flour. And we don't think in those terms these days. We don't think, even just 100 years ago or so, if you'll see references in all kinds of literature, popular literature, to the best butter, the best grain. Today we think best butter. You get butter from a store. You go to the supermarket and you get butter and it's all the same. Maybe the stuff from Europe tastes a little different, but there's no such thing as best butter. There's no such thing as best flour. You can have a preference in how flour is milled, but you don't go to the supermarket. You don't go to Harris Teeter and you see on the shelf best flour, not second class flour, coarse flour. It isn't done that way. So this is the other way of giving a gift to God. Okay, chapter 3 deals with sacrifices of well-being. So the third type of offering, you have olah, the smoke going and flame going up to the sky. You have mincha, the grain offering. Now the next offering is called zevach, and this is an offering of well-being, of the most frequent. My Chumash says the most frequent kind of zevach, of this kind of sacrifice was zevach shlamim, which which is known as an offering of well-being. Shlamim is it comes from the same root as shalom, which means wholeness, being complete. Shalom means peace, but it comes from a root meaning to be whole. And so you could use the same kinds of animals for a well-being offering, and as you could for a burnt offering, or as a burnt offering. So but the difference was that zevach, the offering of well-being, was not burnt up into ashes. It was cooked, and the priest got to eat it. The Torah is very explicit about what parts of the animal get cooked up, basically as barbecue. And for the priests, it's and what my Chumash is saying is that the sacrifice of well-being was offered by someone who was celebrating. Okay, it was someone saying, not saying don't, not the person who offered a sacrifice of well-being wasn't saying, God, make me whole. He was saying, I am whole. I'm a happy person. So I'm going to celebrate by offering this animal, or this measure of grain to you, so that it can be cooked into delicious barbecue or made into some kind of bread or cake and eaten by the priests. And again, rules and rules and rules. Lots of specificity about what parts of the animals are offered, are cooked on the altar. Again, Aaron's sons are dashing its blood all over the altar.
I have a question.
Yes, Kathy.
The version, I think the version I was reading was saying that probably this whole chapter was really just designed as a priestly text. That maybe, in fact, they say the word Torah probably originally just meant priestly instructions, which I
Right. Well, the word Torah means instruction.
So in a way, the average person, even in those days, may not have been all that concerned about this, other than that they have to bring something at some point.
Yeah, and they did so for the next 1,000 or so years, because we're talking here about what was going on at the altar within the Mishkan, from the time of the Exodus, which is hard to fix exactly, but most scholars think is somewhere in the neighborhood of 1200 BCE, 1300 BCE, to the year 70 CE, when the Second Temple was destroyed. That's more than 1,000 years that people were bringing were bringing sacrifices to the altar.
I was reading, or I was listening to a lecture from like a Great Courses lecture, and the instructor was reading from, citing Josephus
Mm-hmm.
about the burning of the siege of the temple in the 70, and there were like 3 different factions holding Jerusalem, and they were all killing each other, and the Romans were killing them, and there was blood everywhere, but they ran out of sheep to sacrifice. So the priestly sacrifices had to stop. And Josephus says, like, dramatically, that the presence of God left the temple.
Yeah, I mean the whole siege of Jerusalem, it was just awful. There was a lot of internecine fighting among the Jews, as well
There
as
were
being
3
understood
factions
in the
holding
Romans.
different parts of the city, but I thought it was dramatic. I mean, with all the blood flowing everywhere in the city, but they ran out of sheep,
Yeah.
so everything stopped in the temple.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's that's why there was such a scramble to replace it, and it was such a loss. Losing the sacrifice at the temple, losing the temple was so traumatic, and not being able to make the sacrifices there was so traumatic that for years and years afterward, rabbis, the early rabbis, wrote about about ritual as if the temple were still there and as if sacrifices were still being brought.
And that's probably why, to Josephus, it was dramatic, so dramatic that he could imagine or actually see the presence of God leaving
Mm-hmm.
the temple.
Sure.
Rabbi, I got a question.
Sure.
Does the Lord command offerings?
God is commanding, yeah, because right at the beginning, it says, God called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when any of you presents an offering of cattle to God, shall
Right.
choose his offering.
I read that, but it
It's-
doesn't, it says when you do.
Okay.
I didn't see anything that said you
Here's
have
what it
to.
says in my Chumash about as commentary. The conditional word if frequently introduces cultic laws. In other words, this is what's required.
Okay.
Does it say if or when? Because my commentary was saying there's like, at one point they go from the if word to asher, which when they're talking about the king and his sacrifices, instead of saying if you bring, it suddenly says when. They translate asher as when, which implies that definitely the king is going to commit a sin. Whereas in the other cases, maybe the people wouldn't have to bring a sacrifice.
No, actually, asher is more.
They cited it specifically in the part where the king is going to come and.
Can you give me a chapter and verse?
Sure. Let's see here. Sorry, it's when the king has to bring the penance, and it's in the very end, I think, of our section. It probably is
This
5.
part of Leviticus.
Okay,
We didn't
5.
have things yet. You may be looking at the Haftarah.
No, it's not a Haftarah. It's in Leviticus. Gee, oh, let me just look at I'm sorry. It's in. Okay, so they have if 4.2 uses if, and then they go into, but the one loan case reads differently. In case asher, it is a chieftain, so that's 422.
Uh-huh.
So they said it shifts, and his comment is that means that in case, but it's actually means definitely. The other people, it may be there, it's iffy whether they'll commit an infraction. But with the king, it's definite that he's definitely going to do something bad and have to bring a sacrifice. But that's just his interpretation.
Well, a lot of this parsha has to do with sins. This is when we get to we just finished chapter 3, so we've done the burnt offerings, the well-being offerings. Now we're going on to the sin offering.
So they're using if all the time in this point.
They're using the word ki which is translated as when.
Okay.
Uh, ki ki techeta vishgaga mikol mitzvot Adonai. When a person unwittingly, by accident or by omission, incurs guilt in regard to any of God's commandments.
Okay.
Any of God's commandments, asher lo, that are about. Asher is a oh, what did we used to call, what is it called in English grammar?
Preposition.
No, it's a conjunction, and it's I think it's called a coordinating conjunction. It's the kind of that or which or who that introduces a dependent clause, like he is the person who brought the sacrifice.
See. Okay.
Okay, or these are the rules that God expects you to follow. Both of those would be asher in Hebrew. Ki is translated as when. Ki can be a lot of things, but here it means when, on the
Okay.
occasion of. The word for if.
They said that's in 4 point. The other previous chapter 4 things use if, which he says is the word.
Verse 3, chapter 4,
4.
verse 3 starts with the word im.
And that's right. That's what he's referring to, that it shifts from im for regular people to asher for the chieftain.
Mhm.
So the debate is that why did they do that? And he thinks that it's because in the case of the people, it was an if. You might not have a transgression, but a king is definitely going to have a transgression.
Mhm. Okay. And the chieftains are supposed to know better.
Mhm.
So
In 4, though, it seems clearer to me, the language, because speaking of sin, and there's a line says, he shall offer for the sin. That sounds to me like a commandment, or a you shall.
yeah.
Other offerings sound to me more optional. But if you do them, they're like, when you do this, if you bring this, you have to do that. If you bring this, you have to do that.
Mhm.
But and just the way I read it, it sounded as if these initial offerings were, to use my word, optional, I guess, when you choose to do that. But when
Yeah.
you get to 4 and you start speaking of sin, then there is a shall involved.
Mhm.
So I thought the meaning shift though. I
Yeah.
mean, that's how I read it initially. So I don't know if I got that correct or not.
Does there's an element of, there became, certainly once the Jews were in the promised land, there became an element of, you need to bring an offering to God, with or without, you're having committed a sin. That's what Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot are about. Those holidays are pilgrimage festivals, and they were established. They were established so that they all have biblical connections, but they're all agrarian holidays. They're all tied to nature. So these are the times when, once there was a temple in Jerusalem, that farmers would bring sacrifices to the temple on the pilgrimage holidays. This is what my Chumash says about the offerings we read about in chapters 4 and 5. They contain the laws governing the purification offering. That's called chatat, and that's based on the word for sin. The most minor sins. That words based on that root. That's the same root we get chet from, al chet, for the sin of. So they're based on, so the purification offering is called chatat, and then there's an offering called asham, which is the reparation offering. In other words, you bring these offerings because you did something wrong, maybe unintentionally, and you want to get expiation for it. It's it's like a tangible kind of Yom Kippur. And so and it says explicitly, these offerings are effective only for unintended offenses. They don't apply to defiant acts or premeditated crimes. And because there were specified punishments for those intentional sins. So whenever an individual Israelite, a tribal leader, a priest, the high priest, or the entire Israelite community is guilty of inadvertent wrongdoing or failure to do what the law requires, atonement through sacrifice is required. So these laws about sin offering and expiation offering, reparation offering, they reflect a deep concern for sanctity, for holiness. They're intended to maintain the purity of the sanctuary against all forms of defilement that might be caused by the priests or the people, and to ensure the acceptability of all Israelites in God's sight. And that we will see as we go further in Leviticus, the idea of purity above everything. You have to, you want to maintain sacrificial purity, bodily purity, and eventually purity of mind and deed. So, it says here, the purpose of the chatat was not to bribe God to overlook the sin or to balance it with an act of generosity. Its purpose was to acquaint the donor with one's more generous side, and so that instead of seeing oneself as weak and rebellious, a person can say, sometimes I'm weak and rebellious, but that's not the real me. The real me is the one bringing this generous sacrifice. It was how you cleared your conscience. And in chapters 4 and 5, again, you get the rules. What are the rules of sacrifice when a priest did something wrong inadvertently? What is the, what happens if the whole community did something wrong? And, what happens if a chieftain does something wrong? And again, and there's a lot of repetition. You get a lot of, the priest puts his hand on the head of the bull. The bull is slaughtered before God. The blood gets dashed on the altar. A lot of the repetition, there's a lot of repetition. The same things happen, no matter who did it. And then there are also rules about then in chapter 5 we get some of the reasons that someone might have incurred guilt. He heard someone say something like take God's name in vain, or touch something that's impure, like the dead body of an impure animal, or touches a dead human body, and so chapter 5 gives some of the reasons, and then goes on to say, you give a bull. If you can't afford to give a bull, you can give a sheep or a goat. If you can't afford to give a sheep or a goat, you can give 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. And this is how you deal with those. When you give birds, it always starts with twisting their necks, killing them by breaking the neck. And if you can't afford 2 birds, you bring flour. And so in this parsha, we get the copious details of how to bring sacrifices to God, why you might do so, what you bring, how you treat it, what the steps are in offering the sacrifice, and some of the reasons that someone might incur guilt that leads to bringing sacrifice. So any questions at this point? Okay. I'm going to try to put something on screen share, the 2 of the commentaries I saw today. And where did I put them? Commentaries on Vayikra. No. Oh, okay. Okay. Everybody see the document that starts with Devar Torah?
Yes.
Okay. So Devorah Weisberg, who was actually one of my professors at Hebrew Union when I was working on a master's degree, she talks about some of the things we just talked about, and she asks, what were the Israelites trying to accomplish through animal sacrifice? They were trying to reach beyond the known to communicate with God, with the unknown. And she notes that the generic word for an offering, a sacrifice, is korban. And that comes from the Hebrew root meaning to draw near. So the whole idea is this is how you get closer to God. This is a way you get closer to God, by sacrificing part of your holdings. So Devorah makes the point that that offerings can be of many different states. They can be animals, they can be birds, they can be mammals, they can be birds, it can be flour. They have to do with nature, so there's the element of creation in them, and we put in our measure of creativity and work by raising these animals or raising these crops and bringing them to the altar.
Did the priests get some of it as payment? It wasn't clear to me from reading
Yeah,
that.
and in some of the sacrifices they did. They didn't get they did not get part of the they did not get any of the olah. They didn't get anything that was burnt up to ashes on the altar because there was nothing left to eat. But they did get part of the well-being. They always got part of the zevach, the offer, the free will offering. but the commentary that I read today that I really want to share with you is the one by Rabbi Mordechai Silverstein, who was one of my professors at conservative yeshiva during my Israel year in seminary. Notice that he starts by saying rabbinic midrashic collections often open with sales pitches for the book they propose to interpret. In other words, they say, you may not think this makes sense, but really it makes lots of sense, and here's why. So one of the opening midrashim, the opening, stories that fill in a gap in Leviticus reads, once Moses had brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, split for them to see the sea, brought them to the desert, sent down manna for them to eat, brought up water from the well for them, brought the quail for them, and which we're going to encounter in the book of Numbers, and made the Mishkan for them. He asked God, from this point on, what is there for me to do? And God said, your job now is to teach Israel about purity and impurity and how to offer sacrifices before me. And that's what Leviticus is all about. And he notes Rabbi Silverstein notes, the above story was drafted hundreds of years after the last sacrifice had been offered, when these laws no longer played an active role in Jewish life. By studying them, the sages sought not only to preserve their memory, but to be inspired by them. And we see that to this day in our liturgy. Rabbi Silverstein also goes into why, another possible reason that you were supposed to bring the best of what you had, the top of the line. It says Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, opens with the prescription for the offering of animal sacrifices. They were top of the line offerings. They had the potential to be the showiest, like, look, my bull is nicer than your bull, or my goat weighs more than your goat. And so there was a hierarchy in sacrifices. And that's why in Midrash, in the Midrash for Leviticus, in Vayikra Rabbah, you see a paragraph, and this is the second paragraph on this page, that says, better is a person who studies 2 orders of Mishnah and knows them well than someone who studies shallowly lots of Mishnah without mastering them, just so he might be known as a master of Mishnah. In other words, it really doesn't matter, if you don't have much, but you bring the best of what you have, you're doing a much better showing of sacrifice than some rich guy who just pulls a nice animal out of his flock and says, here you go. Rabbi Silverstein concludes by saying, life should not be about making an impression. It's about substance and sincerity. The person who brings a measure of flour mixed with olive oil to the tabernacle, to the altar, is giving just as good a sacrifice as someone who brings a big, perfect bull. And that's the ultimate lesson here, is that give what you can. It's very Marxian. It's very Marxist if you look at it the right way. From each according to his ability, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So from each according to his ability, and whatever you bring is fine. Okay, it's time to wrap things up. Any questions?
why do you think there's a need to sacrifice? I mean, the spirit of this is to have people give something up that is value to them,
Mhm.
to give to the Lord. What is the root of that? Why does the Lord think it's important? Do you understand the question? That
Mhm.
people who may be in need of food give food up.
Mhm.
What is the, I guess, the reasoning or the thinking or you understand what I'm saying?
Part of
Why
it,
does the Lord
you know,
compel
in
that?
a few weeks, we'll get to the holiness code, Leviticus 19, that gives a lot of much more practical sounding commandments to how you're supposed to treat your fellow human being. And part of that is feed the hungry. I think the bottom line for all these sacrifices and for the way what we've substituted for sacrifice, for tangible sacrifices, is devotion to God. Sacrifices show devotion to God. They are a way of drawing close to God. Today, we substitute our time for these sacrifices. There's no temple to which we can bring tangible sacrifices, so we give what we can of our wealth to tzedakah, to charity, to help other people, and to show our devotion to God, we give of our time. And this is clear in the if you look in the Mishnah, the earliest rabbinic works from around that were codified around 200 of the Common Era, you see the rules for conversion to Judaism. And one of the rules is bring a sacrifice to the temple. Well, by the time they wrote that, there was no temple. And they knew fully well there was no temple. But that's why one of the uh, requirements for conversion to Judaism is study. You have to give time to it. You have to, and this is why we spend an awful lot of time in synagogue on Yom Kippur, evening, morning. Religious Jews pray all evening, go home and catch a few Z's, come back early in the morning and are in temple all day praying on Yom Kippur. And they are giving up a day of their lives to show their devotion to God. Whenever we daven, this is one of the reasons services are so long. Are so long among traditional people. We're giving up we're giving up our time to draw closer to God. We could be doing a lot of other things with that time. We could be sleeping. We could be working. We could be biking. But instead, we're sitting in synagogue, or these days on Zoom, giving up our time to God. Just by being here studying Torah, you're showing devotion to God. So, kol hakavod to the three of you. I think we're going to stop there unless you have other questions. That was a great question, Rick, by the way.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Good night.
Next week, more blood.